The creek had flowed for 50 years through Sarah's backyard until Richard Blackwood arrived with his bulldozers at dawn. As the HOA president's concrete wall rose from the earth, blocking the water that had been her lifeline, Sarah discovered something that would bring him to his knees. The very creek he'd stolen was protected by federal law. But Richard had one final, devastating secret that would force Sarah to choose between her family's legacy and destroying the man who'd declared war on her neighborhood. The sound of diesel engines shattered the morning calm like breaking glass. Sarah Mitchell bolted upright in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs as the rumble of heavy machinery invaded her sanctuary. Through the bedroom window, she watched in horror as a bulldozer carved through the earth along her property line, its yellow blade scraping away decades of careful landscaping. "What the hell?" she whispered, throwing on her robe and racing barefoot across the dew-soaked grass toward the creek that had meandered through her backyard for as long as she could remember. The creek wasn't just water, it was memory. Her father had built their family home here 30 years ago specifically because of this gentle stream, where she'd caught her first fish, where her children had launched paper boats, where her mother had scattered wildflowers along its banks before cancer claimed her. Now, construction workers in hard hats stood knee-deep in the water, driving steel posts into the streambed. "Stop!" Sarah shouted, but her voice was lost in the mechanical roar. A man in a pristine white shirt and khakis emerged from behind the bulldozer, his silver hair gleaming in the morning sun. Richard Blackwood, HOA president, retired city planner, and her new next-door neighbor. He'd moved into the massive colonial 6 months ago, immediately filing complaints about everything from her vegetable garden to the color of her mailbox. "Morning, Sarah," Richard called out, his voice carrying the false warmth of a politician. "Sorry about the early start. Should be wrapped up by noon." "You can't do this." Sarah's hands trembled as she pointed at the workers. "This is my property line. That creek runs through my yard." Richard pulled out his phone, scrolling through documents with practiced efficiency. "Actually, according to the survey I commissioned, the creek serves as the official boundary between our properties. The HOA board voted last night to install a retaining wall for flood control." "Last night? I never received notice of any meeting." The notice was posted on the community bulletin board as required by our bylaws. Richard's smile was razor-thin. Section 4.2 states that any construction affecting multiple properties requires only 72 hours advance notice. Sarah's mind raced. She'd been caring for her sick daughter all week, hadn't checked the bulletin board in days. Even if that's true, you can't just dam up a creek. The water has to go somewhere. The water will be redirected around the wall through a series of culverts on my property. Richard gestured toward the concrete pipes being unloaded from a truck. "It's actually more efficient this way. No more flooding in heavy rains." "Flooding? This creek has never flooded in 30 years. Climate change, Sarah. We have to think ahead." Richard's tone suggested he was explaining basic mathematics to a child. "The wall will also provide better security and privacy for both our properties." Sarah watched in mounting horror as the workers began pouring concrete footings. The creek's gentle babble was already muffled by the growing barrier. "Richard, please. This creek means everything to my family. My father chose this lot specifically. Because your father's dead." The words hit like a physical blow. Richard's mask of civility slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. "Property values in this neighborhood have increased 40% since I moved in. We need to maintain certain standards." "You bastard." Sarah's voice cracked. "You absolute bastard." "Language, Sarah. There are children in this neighborhood." Richard nodded toward the workers. "Proceed with the installation." Sarah ran back to her house, her mind spinning. In her kitchen, she pulled out every document related to her property, deed, survey, tax records. Her hands shook as she dialed her real estate attorney, leaving a frantic voicemail. Then she called the city planning office, only to be transferred 3 times before learning that Richard himself had signed off on the construction permits during his consulting days. By noon, the concrete wall stood 4 feet high, its gray surface an obscene scar across the landscape. The creek's flow had been reduced to a trickle, the water backing up into a stagnant pool that would soon become a breeding ground for mosquitoes. Sarah's daughter Emma, 16 and still pale from her recent bout with pneumonia, stood at the kitchen window with tears streaming down her face. "Mom, they killed our creek." "No, honey. They didn't kill it. They just redirected it." But even as Sarah spoke the words, she knew they were a lie. The creek that had flowed freely for generations was gone, replaced by Richard's engineered solution. That afternoon, Sarah walked the neighborhood, knocking on doors. Most of her neighbors seemed resigned to Richard's authority, their voices dropping to whispers when they spoke about the HOA president. "He's not someone you want to cross," warned Mrs. Chen, who lived 3 houses down. "He had the Petersons cited for 17 violations last month. They had to repaint their entire house." "But this isn't about paint colors," Sarah protested. "He's destroying our natural environment." "Richard knows what he's doing," said Tom Bradley, the accountant who lived across the street. "He's got connections at City Hall. Besides, that wall probably increased all our property values." Sarah found only one ally in Maria Santos, a feisty grandmother who'd lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone. "That man's been nothing but trouble since he arrived," Maria said, her thick accent carrying decades of frustration. "He tried to make me remove my rose bushes because they weren't neighborhood appropriate. I told him where he could stick his appropriateness. Will you help me fight this?" Maria's weathered hands gripped Sarah's shoulders. "Mija, I've been fighting bullies my whole life. But Richard Blackwood isn't just any bully. He's got the system on his side." That evening, Sarah researched everything she could find about Richard Blackwood. His consulting firm had handled municipal projects across 3 states. His wife had died in a car accident 2 years ago, a tragedy that apparently hadn't softened his edges. He'd served on planning boards, zoning committees, and architectural review panels, always leaving behind a trail of stricter regulations and higher fees. As darkness fell, Sarah stood at her back door, listening to the unnatural silence where the creek's gentle murmur had once provided a natural lullaby. The stagnant water behind Richard's wall already smelled of decay. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Mom, I found something. Come to my room." Sarah climbed the stairs to find her daughter hunched over her laptop, surrounded by printouts and research notes. Despite her illness, Emma had inherited her grandfather's methodical mind and her mother's stubborn streak. "I've been researching federal water protection laws," Emma said, her voice gaining strength for the first time in days. "Mom, I think what Richard did might be illegal." Sarah's heart jumped. "What do you mean?" "The Clean Water Act protects navigable waterways from obstruction. But here's the thing, it also protects tributaries that feed into navigable waters." Emma pulled up a map on her screen. "Our creek flows into Miller's Pond, which feeds into the Blackstone River, which is definitely navigable. So Richard needed federal permits. Not just permits. Any alteration to a protected waterway requires environmental impact studies, public comment periods, and approval from the Army Corps of Engineers." Emma's fingers flew across the keyboard. None of which happened here. Sarah felt a surge of hope mixed with rage. "Are you sure about this?" "I'm sure. But Mom, there's something else." Emma's voice dropped to a whisper. "I found out why Richard really built that wall. It's not about flood control or property values." "What do you mean?" Emma turned her laptop screen toward her mother. On the screen was a satellite image of the neighborhood, with overlay maps showing underground utilities. "Look at this. The creek doesn't just flow through our yard, it flows directly under where Richard wants to build his addition." Sarah's blood turned to ice. "Addition?" "A 3-story addition with a basement wine cellar. The permits were filed yesterday, right after the wall went up." Emma's voice was barely audible. "Mom, he didn't just steal our creek. He's been planning this for months. The wall isn't to redirect the water, it's to stop it completely so he can build over the streambed." Sarah stared at the screen, her mind reeling. Richard hadn't just violated federal law, he'd orchestrated an elaborate deception to steal their creek for his own construction project. But even as rage boiled in her chest, she realized that Emma's discovery was only the beginning. If Richard was willing to break federal law and deceive his neighbors, what else was he hiding? The next morning, Sarah stood at her kitchen window, watching Richard direct a team of surveyors as they marked the boundaries of his planned addition. The man who'd claimed to care about neighborhood standards was about to turn his backyard into a construction zone that would destroy the natural beauty he'd sworn to protect. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table until dawn, surrounded by printouts of federal regulations, environmental protection statutes, and aerial photographs of the neighborhood dating back 15 years. Emma's research had cracked open something massive, but Sarah needed proof that would hold up against Richard's political connections. At 6 a.m., she called the Army Corps of Engineers regional office in Boston. After being transferred 4 times, she finally reached Janet Morrison, a compliance officer who listened with growing concern as Sarah described the creek obstruction. If what you're telling me is accurate, this is a serious violation of Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, Janet said, her voice sharp with professional alarm. We need to schedule an immediate site inspection. How soon can you get here? I can be there this afternoon, but I need to warn you, if someone deliberately obstructed a protected waterway without permits, we are looking at federal criminal charges. Fines can reach $37,500 per day of violation. Sarah's hand trembled as she wrote down the numbers. Richard had been violating federal law for 3 days already. If convicted, he could face over $100,000 in fines, plus potential jail time. After hanging up, Sarah walked to her back door and stared at the concrete wall that had transformed her sanctuary into a stagnant swamp. The morning air already carried the smell of decay. Dead fish floated in the backed-up water, and clouds of mosquitoes swarmed above the surface. A soft knock at the front door interrupted her thoughts. Sarah opened it to find Maria Santos holding a thermos of coffee and a manila folder thick with documents. I couldn't sleep either, Maria said, stepping inside. I've been making phone calls. What kind of phone calls? Maria's weathered face broke into a grim smile. The kind that rich men like Richard Blackwood don't expect from an old Mexican woman. I called my nephew Carlos, he's a federal prosecutor in Phoenix. He gave me some very interesting information about your Mr. Blackwood. Sarah's pulse quickened. What did he find? Richard's consulting firm is under investigation by the EPA for fraudulent environmental assessments. 3 projects in Arizona, all involving water rights violations. Maria opened the folder, revealing a stack of legal documents. He's been falsifying impact studies for developers who want to build in protected watersheds. Jesus! Sarah sank into a chair. So this isn't the first time he's done something like this. Gets better. Or worse, depending on how you look at it. Maria pulled out a photograph, a newspaper clipping showing Richard at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. 2 years ago, he approved a shopping center construction in Tucson that destroyed a century-old creek. The environmental group that fought it was led by a woman named Patricia Valdez. Sarah studied the photo. Patricia Valdez was a slight woman with graying hair and fierce eyes, standing with a group of protesters holding signs that read "Save Our Water" and "Blackwood equals corruption." Where is she now? Maria's expression darkened. She died in a car accident 6 months after the shopping center was built. Same accident that killed Richard's wife. The coffee mug slipped from Sarah's hands, shattering on the kitchen floor. They were in the same car. Different cars, same intersection, same night. Patricia was driving home from a city council meeting where she'd presented new evidence about Richard's fraudulent assessments. Richard's wife was coming home from dinner with friends. Maria's voice dropped to a whisper. Carlos says the accident report raised some questions that were never answered. Sarah's mind raced. You think Richard was involved? I think Richard Blackwood is a man who doesn't let obstacles stand in his way. And I think moving to this neighborhood wasn't random, he's running from something. Before Sarah could respond, her phone rang. Emma's school nurse was calling to say her daughter had collapsed during first period and was being taken to the hospital. Sarah's world tilted on its axis. I have to go, she said, grabbing her keys. The Corps of Engineers is coming at 2:00. Can you? I'll handle it, Maria said firmly. Go take care of your daughter. Sarah spent the morning in the emergency room, holding Emma's hand as doctors ran tests. The pneumonia had returned, worse than before. Emma's breathing was labored, her fever spiking despite medication. The stress isn't helping her recovery, Dr. Peterson explained. She needs complete rest and a calm environment. Sarah wanted to laugh bitterly. With Richard's construction project escalating and federal investigators arriving, calm was the last thing their home would provide. At 1:30 p.m., Sarah reluctantly left the hospital to meet the Corps of Engineers inspector. She found Janet Morrison standing at the concrete wall with Maria, both women wearing expressions of professional outrage. Mrs. Mitchell, this is exactly the kind of violation we take very seriously, Janet said, photographing the stagnant water behind the wall. The ecological damage is already extensive. How extensive? Fish kills, habitat destruction, water contamination, and this is just the beginning. If this blockage isn't removed immediately, the entire downstream ecosystem could collapse. Janet made notes on her tablet. I'm issuing a cease and desist order effective immediately. Mr. Blackwood has 24 hours to begin restoration, or we'll have federal marshals here with heavy equipment. Sarah felt a surge of vindication, but it was tempered by worry about Emma. What about the construction permits he filed for his addition? Those permits are now void. Any construction over a protected waterway requires federal approval, which he clearly doesn't have. Janet's professional demeanor softened slightly. Mrs. Mitchell, I want you to know that we take retribution against whistleblowers very seriously. If Mr. Blackwood tries to intimidate you or your family, call me immediately. The word retribution sent a chill through Sarah. She thought about Emma in the hospital, about Patricia Valdez's car accident, about the way Richard had watched her house with such personal intensity. After Janet left, Sarah and Maria walked through the neighborhood, knocking on doors to share the news. The response was mixed. Some neighbors were thrilled that someone was finally standing up to Richard, while others seemed genuinely frightened. You don't understand, whispered Joyce Patterson, the elderly woman who lived next to Richard's other side. He's not just the HOA president. He knows everyone at City Hall, the planning board, the zoning committee. He can make life very difficult for people who cross him. He's about to face federal charges, Sarah said. His connections won't help him there. Joyce glanced nervously toward Richard's house. You think that man got where he is by playing by the rules? He's been planning something ever since he moved in. The creek was just the beginning. As if summoned by their conversation, Richard's BMW pulled into his driveway. Sarah watched him climb out, his movements sharp and angry. He'd clearly been served with the cease and desist order. Their eyes met across the yard. Richard's expression was cold fury mixed with something Sarah couldn't quite identify, disappointment. Betrayal. As if she'd failed some test he'd set for her. He walked to his property line, stopping just short of the concrete wall. Sarah, he called out, his voice carrying across the evening air. I hope you're proud of yourself. I'm proud of following the law, she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. The law. Richard's laugh was bitter. You have no idea what you've started. No idea at all. Is that a threat? It's a promise. Richard's smile was razor-thin. You think bringing in federal inspectors makes you safe? You think hiding behind environmental regulations protects your family? He gestured toward the hospital in the distance. How's Emma feeling today? Sarah's blood turned to ice. What did you say? I said, how's your daughter feeling? I heard she had another episode at school. Pneumonia's such a tricky illness, so many complications can arise. Richard's voice was conversational, almost friendly. Especially when patients are exposed to additional stress or environmental toxins. You stay away from my daughter. I don't need to go near your daughter, Sarah. She's already breathing the air from that lovely pond you're so eager to protect. Richard pointed to the stagnant water behind his wall. Funny thing about standing water, it breeds all sorts of nasty bacteria. The kind that can turn a simple respiratory infection into something much more serious. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. You son of a bitch. You planned this. You knew the water would stagnate. I planned a lot of things, Sarah. The wall was just the opening move. Richard's mask of civility dropped completely. You want to play with federal regulations? Fine. But understand that every action has consequences. And some consequences are irreversible. Richard turned and walked back to his house, leaving Sarah standing by the toxic pond that had once been her family's creek. The evening air carried the smell of decay and something else, the sweet, sickly scent of chemicals she couldn't identify. Maria appeared at her side. Mija, we need to get that water tested. Tonight. Why? Because I don't think what's making Emma sick is just pneumonia. And I don't think that smell is just from stagnant water. Sarah stared at the dark water, her mind racing. Richard's timing was too perfect, the wall going up just as Emma's illness returned, the specific mention of environmental toxins, the confidence in his threats. He's poisoning the water, she whispered. We need proof, Maria said grimly. But first, we need to get Emma away from here. Tonight. As they walk. Sarah didn't go home that night. Instead, she sat in Emma's hospital room, watching her daughter's labored breathing while her phone buzzed with increasingly frantic messages. Maria had collected water samples from the stagnant pond and rushed them to her nephew's contact at the state environmental lab. The results would take 48 hours, time Emma might not have. Dr. Peterson entered with a chart, his expression grim. We've identified the problem. Emma's pneumonia has developed into a secondary infection caused by exposure to Legionella bacteria. Legionella? Sarah's voice cracked. How is that possible? It's commonly found in stagnant water systems, particularly where there's been recent construction or water disturbance. The bacteria become airborne through water droplets and mist. Dr. Peterson pulled up Emma's chest X-rays on the wall monitor. The infection is aggressive, but treatable if we caught it early enough. Sarah's hands shook as she processed the information. Richard hadn't just threatened her daughter, he'd created the perfect biological weapon, then positioned it directly next to their home. Doctor, we had a creek that was recently dammed. Could that be the source? Absolutely. Any disruption to natural water flow can create ideal breeding conditions for Legionella. The bacteria thrive in water temperatures between 77 and 108 degrees Fahrenheit. Dr. Peterson's expression darkened. Mrs. Mitchell, if someone deliberately created these conditions near your home, knowing a vulnerable person lived there, we could be looking at attempted murder. The word murder hit Sarah like a physical blow. She thought about Richard's confident smile, his specific mention of environmental toxins, the way he'd asked about Emma's health with such calculated concern. At 2 a.m., Sarah's phone rang. Maria's voice was tight with rage. The lab results came back early. Sarah, you need to sit down. What did they find? Legionella pneumophila, just like the doctor suspected. But that's not all. Maria's voice dropped to a whisper. They also found traces of chlorine compounds and industrial solvents, chemicals that would accelerate bacterial growth while making the water smell like normal pond scum. Sarah's vision blurred. He spiked the water. Gets worse. My nephew ran the chemical profile through the FBI database. The exact combination matches a case from Arizona, a community leader who opposed Richard's shopping center development. She got sick from contaminated groundwater and died before she could testify against him. Patricia Valdez. No, Mija. Patricia died in the car accident. This was another woman, 6 months earlier. Elena Rodriguez. Maria's voice was barely audible. She had teenage twins. Sarah's world tilted. Richard wasn't just a corrupt developer, he was a serial killer who used environmental contamination as his weapon. And Emma was his latest target. We need to call the police, Sarah said. With what proof? The chemical analysis shows contamination, but not how it got there. Richard's too smart to leave fingerprints on a water sample. Maria. Paused. But I may have found something better. I've been digging into Richard's past and I discovered why he really moved here. Why? Because this neighborhood is his retirement plan. He's been slowly buying up properties through shell companies, planning to demolish everything and build luxury condos. The creek was the only thing preventing full development. It's protected wetlands that can't be built on. Sarah felt pieces clicking into place. So he destroys the creek, eliminates the environmental protection, and clears the way for his development. Exactly. But here's the kicker, he needed someone to fight the creek destruction first, to establish a legal precedent that environmental regulations could be overridden for neighborhood improvements. Maria's voice carried bitter understanding. Sarah, you weren't his enemy. You were part of his plan. The revelation hit Sarah like a sledgehammer. Richard had orchestrated the entire conflict, knowing she'd fight the creek destruction, knowing she'd bring in federal authorities, knowing the legal battle would create the precedent he needed to override environmental protections throughout the neighborhood. He played me, Sarah whispered. He played all of us. But he made one mistake, he got impatient. Poisoning Emma was supposed to break your spirit, make you give up the fight. Instead, it gave us the evidence we need to destroy him. Sarah looked at her daughter's pale face, the oxygen mask covering her mouth, the monitors tracking her vital signs. What evidence? The chemical analysis proves deliberate contamination. My nephew's FBI contact is very interested in the pattern similarities to the Arizona cases. And Maria's voice carried a note of triumph. I found Richard's insurance records. He's been buying massive liability policies for environmental contamination, policies that specifically exclude coverage for intentional acts. What does that mean? It means Richard Blackwood is about to lose everything. His insurance company is going to investigate every claim, every project, every suspicious death. And when they find the pattern, Maria's laugh was sharp. Financial ruin will be the least of his problems. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of exhaustion and rage. How do we prove he contaminated the water? We don't need to prove it. We need to make him confess. Before Sarah could ask what Maria meant, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Your daughter's infection is just the beginning. Drop the federal complaint or watch her condition deteriorate. You have 24 hours. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Maria, he just threatened Emma directly. Perfect. Forward that text to my nephew immediately. Threatening a federal witness is a felony. Maria's voice carried grim satisfaction. Richard just made his first real mistake. At dawn, Sarah drove home to shower and change clothes. The neighborhood felt different, windows that had been dark for weeks now glowed with early morning light. Cars that usually sat empty in driveways were moving. People were up, active, talking. Mrs. Chen flagged her down as she pulled into her driveway. Sarah, we heard about Emma. The whole neighborhood is talking. Talking about what? About what? Richard did. About the poisoned water. Mrs. Chen's usually timid voice carried an edge of steel. We are not going to let him get away with this. Sarah looked around and realized that other neighbors were gathering, Tom Bradley, the Petersons, the Johnsons from the corner house. Even families she'd never spoken to were standing on their porches, watching her with expressions of grim determination. We want to help, Tom said. Whatever it takes. Sarah felt a surge of hope mixed with caution. This is dangerous. Richard isn't just a bully, he's the murderer, finished Joyce Patterson, the elderly woman who lived next to Richard. We know. We've all been comparing notes. Strange illnesses, mysterious accidents, families who moved away suddenly. Her voice shook with decades of suppressed fear. He's been terrorizing this neighborhood for months, and we've all been too scared to fight back. What changed? You changed, said a voice from behind her. Sarah turned to see Maria approaching with a tall man in a federal jacket. When you stood up to Richard, you gave the rest of us permission to remember our courage. The man in the federal jacket extended his hand. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm Agent David Chen with the FBI Environmental Crimes Unit. We need to talk. Sarah's heart hammered as Agent Chen explained that Richard Blackwood was the subject of a multi-state investigation into environmental terrorism. The Arizona cases were just the beginning. Similar patterns had emerged in Colorado, Nevada, and Utah. Always the same, a community leader who opposed development projects, followed by mysterious contamination, illness, and death. The problem is that Richard's extremely careful, Agent Chen explained. He uses naturally occurring bacteria and compounds that could theoretically appear in any contaminated water system. Without direct evidence of tampering, we can't prove intent. What about the threatening text? That's enough to arrest him for witness intimidation, but not enough to convict him for the murders. We need him to confess, or we need to catch him in the act. Agent Chen studied Sarah's face. Mrs. Mitchell would like to ask you to help us. Set a trap. Sarah's mind raced. What kind of trap? We want you to appear to give up. Call Richard, tell him you're dropping the federal complaint in exchange for him leaving Emma alone. Make him think he's won. Agent Chen's expression was grim. Then we wait for him to make his next move. What if he doesn't take the bait? Then your daughter recovers, the creek gets restored, and Richard walks away to kill again in another state. Agent Chen's voice carried the weight of too many unsolved cases. But if he does take the bait? Sarah thought about Emma in the hospital, about Patricia Valdez and Elena Rodriguez, about all the other victims whose names she'd never know. What do you need me to do? That afternoon, Sarah made the call. Richard answered on the first ring, his voice carrying smug satisfaction. Sarah, I'm so glad you came to your senses. I'm dropping the federal complaint, she said, letting exhaustion color her voice. Emma's dying, and I can't fight you anymore. A wise decision. I'll have the creek wall removed within the week. And you'll leave my family alone. Of course. I'm not a monster, Sarah. I'm just a man who understands that progress requires sacrifice. Richard's voice carried mock sympathy. How is Emma feeling, by the way? The question was perfectly innocent, but Sarah heard the anticipation underneath. Richard was waiting for her to break, to beg, to give him the satisfaction of complete victory. Workers positioned themselves at key points while neighbors took shifts monitoring Richard's house from their windows. Maria had organized a communication network using a group text that buzzed with updates every few minutes. Sarah sat in Emma's hospital room, watching her daughter sleep while her phone displayed a constant stream of messages. Maria, target leaving house with large duffel bag. Tom, heading toward creek area. Joyce, definitely carrying chemical containers. Agent Chen. All units standby. Do not approach. Dr. Peterson had moved Emma to isolation as a precaution, but her condition was stable. The antibiotic treatment was working, and her fever had broken during the night. Sarah allowed herself a moment of relief before her phone buzzed with an urgent message from Maria. Emergency. Richard's not alone. 2 men in hazmat suits. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Richard hadn't just come to contaminate the water again, he'd brought professionals. This wasn't about killing Emma anymore, it was about destroying evidence and eliminating witnesses. Agent Chen's voice crackled through the phone. Mrs. Mitchell, we have a problem. Richard's brought in a professional cleanup crew. They are not just adding more contamination, they are removing all traces of the original chemicals. What does that mean? It means our evidence is about to disappear. Without the contaminated water samples, we can't prove deliberate poisoning. Agent Chen's frustration was palpable. We need to move now, before they finish sanitizing the scene. Through the hospital room window, Sarah could see smoke rising from the direction of her neighborhood. Agent Chen, something's burning. We know. Richard's crew is using industrial-grade bleach and oxidizers to destroy all biological evidence. The chemical reaction is creating toxic fumes that are forcing neighbors to evacuate. Agent Chen's voice carried grim urgency. Mrs. Mitchell, he's not just destroying evidence. He's turning your neighborhood into a disaster zone. Sarah's mind raced. Richard's final play wasn't just about covering his tracks, it was about creating a chemical emergency that would force federal authorities to condemn the entire area. The neighborhood would be declared uninhabitable, residents would be forced to sell at rock-bottom prices, and Richard's shell companies would buy up everything for his development project. He's going to poison everyone, Sarah whispered. Not if we stop him first. But we need proof of his involvement before he disappears behind his cleanup crew. Agent Chen paused. Mrs. Mitchell, we need you to make another call. Make Richard think the chemicals are affecting Emma worse than expected. Make him gloat. Make him confess. Sarah's hands shook as she dialed Richard's number. He answered immediately, his voice barely containing excitement. Sarah, I hope you're somewhere safe. There's been a terrible chemical accident at the creek site. Chemical accident? Sarah let panic color her voice. Richard, Emma's condition is getting worse. The doctors say she's having some kind of reaction to airborne toxins. Oh no. That's very concerning. Richard's voice carried mock sympathy that barely concealed his satisfaction. I warned you that environmental contamination could have delayed effects. The doctors are asking questions about possible chemical exposure. They want to know if there's been any industrial activity near our house. There was a pause. Sarah could almost hear Richard's calculating mind at work. Well, the creek restoration did involve some chemical treatments. Nothing dangerous, of course, but sensitive individuals might react poorly. Chemical treatments? You said it was just concrete removal. Sarah, I'm trying to help you, but I need you to understand something. Richard's voice dropped to a whisper. The substances we use to accelerate the biological breakdown of organic matter in the water, they are not exactly approved for residential use. Sarah's heart pounded. Agent Chen had been right, Richard couldn't resist explaining his cleverness. What kind of substances? Industrial-grade bacterial cultures, chemical accelerants, pH modifiers. Richard's voice carried the pride of a craftsman describing his work. It's quite sophisticated, actually. The bacteria produce the toxins naturally, but the accelerants ensure rapid multiplication and maximum potency. You're talking about the Legionella. Among other things. Legionella is just the delivery system, Sarah. The real weapon is the chemical cocktail that keeps the bacteria thriving and spreading. Richard's mask was completely gone now. In Arizona, it took Elena Rodriguez 3 months to die. But with the improvements I've made to the formula, Emma should succumb much faster. Sarah nearly dropped the phone. Richard had just confessed to murdering Elena Rodriguez and attempting to murder Emma. Agent Chen's recording equipment would capture every word. You killed Elena Rodriguez, Sarah said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. I solved a problem. Elena was going to destroy a $100 million development project with her environmental lawsuits. Sometimes progress requires sacrifice. Richard's voice carried cold pride. Just like your creek situation. The neighborhood needs development, Sarah. Your sentimental attachment to a muddy stream was blocking economic progress. So you decided to kill my daughter. I decided to remove an obstacle. Emma's illness was just a tool to break your will to fight. Richard's voice grew contemplative. Though I must admit, I've grown quite fond of the process. There's something elegant about using nature's own toxins to eliminate opposition. You're insane. I'm efficient. Do you know how many environmental activists I've eliminated over the years? 12 confirmed, possibly more. Each one thought they could stop progress with their regulations and lawsuits. Richard's voice carried the satisfaction of a serial killer reviewing his work. But bacteria don't care about environmental protection laws, Sarah. They just kill. Sarah realized that Richard was confessing to years of environmental terrorism, admitting to a pattern of murders that stretched across multiple states. Agent Chen's investigation had struck gold. The federal agents will stop you, Sarah said. Richard laughed. The federal agents are about to face their own emergency. The chemical cleanup I'm conducting will create an environmental disaster. That makes the original contamination look trivial. By the time they sort through the hazmat protocols and bureaucratic red tape, I'll be in a non-extradition country with a new identity. You're destroying the entire neighborhood. I'm clearing The site for development. The chemical emergency will force everyone to evacuate, property values will collapse, and my acquisition companies will buy everything at fire sale prices. Richard's voice carried the satisfaction of a man whose plan was unfolding perfectly. Within 5 years, this will be a luxury condominium complex worth $300 million. Sarah felt sick. Richard hadn't just planned to kill Emma, he'd planned to destroy every family in the neighborhood, all for a real estate development project. "You won't get away with this," Sarah said. "I already have. The cleanup crew is sanitizing all evidence of the original contamination while creating a new chemical emergency that will dominate the investigation. The FBI will be so busy managing the hazmat crisis that they'll never connect the dots to the original murders." Richard's voice carried cold triumph. "Goodbye, Sarah. Give Emma my regards." The line went dead. Sarah sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of Richard's confession. He'd admitted to 12 murders, revealed his method of using bacterial contamination, and outlined his plan to destroy the entire neighborhood for profit. Agent Chen's voice crackled through her phone. "Mrs. Mitchell, we got everything. Richard Blackwood is going down for multiple counts of murder, environmental terrorism, and conspiracy to commit mass poisoning." Through the hospital window, Sarah watched federal agents in hazmat suits surrounding Richard's property. She could see Richard himself being led away in handcuffs, his white shirt stained with chemicals, his silver hair disheveled for the first time since she'd met him. But the victory felt hollow. The neighborhood was being evacuated, families were losing their homes, and the environmental damage might take years to repair. Richard's final act of spite was destroying the community he'd failed to control. "Agent Chen, what about the neighborhood? What about everyone's homes? The EPA is bringing in a full remediation team. It'll take months, maybe years, but we'll restore the area to habitability." Agent Chen's voice carried grim determination. "And Mrs. Mitchell? Richard's insurance policies are going to pay for every penny of cleanup and relocation costs. His shell company's assets are being frozen, and his personal fortune will be liquidated to compensate victims." Sarah watched the FBI agents loading evidence from Richard's house, boxes of chemicals, computer files, and what looked like detailed plans for similar operations in other states. The scope of Richard's criminal enterprise was still being uncovered, but it was clear that his arrest would prevent dozens of future murders. As the sun set over the evacuated neighborhood, Sarah received a text from Maria. "Mija, we won. But more importantly, we survived. And Emma's going to be okay." Sarah looked at her daughter, whose color was returning and whose breathing was steady. The monitors showed improving vital signs, and Dr. Peterson had mentioned that Emma might be able to go home within the week, though home would be a temporary apartment while the neighborhood underwent environmental restoration. But as Sarah watched, 6 months after Richard Blackwood's arrest, Sarah stood beside the restored creek, watching crystal clear water flow freely through her backyard for the first time since the concrete wall had risen. Emma sat on the bank beside her, healthy and laughing as she sketched the wildflowers that had returned to bloom along the water's edge. The FBI's investigation had expanded far beyond anything Sarah could have imagined. Richard seized files, revealed a network of corrupt developers, environmental consultants, and city officials who had been systematically eliminating opposition to profitable but destructive projects. The conspiracy stretched across 8 states and involved 37 confirmed murders disguised as environmental accidents. Agent Chen had become a regular visitor to the neighborhood during the restoration process. Today, he brought news that made Sarah's heart soar with vindication. The Department of Justice announced this morning that Richard Blackwood has been sentenced to life in federal prison without possibility of parole, Agent Chen said, settling into a chair on Sarah's newly rebuilt deck. 12 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit environmental terrorism, and racketeering. He'll die behind bars. What about his co-conspirators? Sarah asked. 43 arrests so far. The entire network is collapsing. Agent Chen smiled grimly. Your phone recording broke the case wide open. Without Richard's confession, we never could have connected the patterns across state lines. Sarah thought about all the families who would never have to face what she'd endured, all the children who would grow up breathing clean air instead of bacterial toxins. Was it worth it? All the destruction, the evacuation, the trauma. Ask Elena Rodriguez's twins, Agent Chen said softly. We found them living with relatives in Phoenix, still wondering why their mother died. Yesterday, I got to tell them that the man who killed her will never hurt another family. Emma looked up from her sketch pad. Mom, remember when you said sometimes you have to fight monsters to protect the people you love? Sarah smiled, remembering the conversation from months ago when Emma had been scared and sick and the future had seemed hopeless. I remember. You didn't just fight the monster. You inspired everyone else to fight their monsters too. Emma gestured toward the neighborhood where restoration work continued on houses that had been damaged by Richard's chemical assault. Look what we all built together. Sarah followed her daughter's gaze and felt a surge of pride. The neighborhood that had once been paralyzed by fear was now thriving with collaboration. Mrs. Chen had organized a community garden where the old bulletin board used to stand. Tom Bradley had established a neighborhood watch program that actually protected people instead of enforcing arbitrary rules. Maria Santos had been elected as the new HOA president, and her first act had been to abolish punitive fines in favor of community service projects. Most remarkably, the families had chosen to rebuild rather than relocate. Property values had initially plummeted after the environmental disaster, but they'd recovered stronger than ever as word spread about the tight-knit community that had defeated environmental terrorism. There's something else, Agent Chen said, pulling out an official document. The EPA is designating your creek as a protected waterway under the Clean Water Act. It'll be illegal to obstruct or pollute it in any way. Sarah felt tears of joy welling in her eyes. Her father's creek, the stream where he'd taught her to fish, where her mother had scattered wildflowers, where Emma had launched paper boats, would be protected forever. And, Agent Chen continued with a smile, the Department of Justice is awarding you the Citizens Medal for Environmental Heroism. You'll be recognized at a ceremony in Washington next month. Emma jumped up excitedly. Mom, you're going to meet the president. Sarah laughed, but her mind was already turning to practical matters. Agent Chen, what about compensation for the neighborhood? People lost months of their lives, had their homes contaminated. Richard's personal assets totaled $47 million. His shell companies held another $112 million. All of it is being distributed to victims across all 8 states. Agent Chen's smile was satisfied. Every family in this neighborhood is receiving a settlement that covers not just their losses, but their children's college educations. Sarah stared at him in amazement. You mean? Emma's education is fully funded through graduate school if she wants it. Along with every other child who was affected by Richard's crimes. Agent Chen stood to leave. Justice isn't just about punishment, Mrs. Mitchell. It's about restoration. As Agent Chen drove away, neighbors began gathering for the weekly community barbecue that had become tradition during the restoration. Sarah watched Maria directing the setup with the efficiency of a general, Joyce Patterson teaching children how to identify different types of fish in the creek, and Tom Bradley grilling burgers while discussing plans for a new playground. Mom, Emma said quietly, do you think Dad would be proud of what we did? Sarah's husband had died in a construction accident 3 years earlier, leaving her to raise Emma alone. She'd often wondered what he would think of the choices she'd made, the risks she'd taken. I think he'd be amazed by how strong you were through everything. And I think he'd love seeing our creek protected forever. What about you? Do you think he'd be proud of you? Sarah considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, she'd been a grieving widow trying to keep her family afloat, intimidated by an HOA president and resigned to accepting whatever fate handed her. Now she was an environmental hero who'd exposed a serial killer and saved countless lives. I think he'd be proud that I finally learned to fight back, Sarah said. As the sun set over the neighborhood, Sarah walked the length of the creek, marveling at how quickly nature had restored itself once the contamination was removed. Fish had returned to the clear water, birds nested in the restored vegetation, and the air smelled of wildflowers instead of chemicals. Her phone buzzed with a message from Patricia Valdez's sister in Arizona, thank you for giving my family closure. Patricia's children finally understand that their mother died a hero, not a victim. Similar messages arrived daily from relatives of Richard's victims across the country. The conspiracy had claimed 37 lives, but Sarah's courage in fighting back had prevented dozens more. Environmental activists in Colorado, Nevada, and Utah were alive today because Richard Blackwood was behind bars instead of operating his bacterial murder machine. Emma appeared beside her, carrying a small paper boat folded from newspaper. "Want to make a wish?" Sarah smiled, remembering the tradition from her own childhood. "What should we wish for?" "For all the other families who are fighting monsters. Like Richard. That they find the courage to stand up and fight back." Emma placed the boat in the gentle current. "And that they remember they are not fighting alone." Sarah watched the paper boat float downstream, carrying Emma's wish toward Miller's Pond and eventually the Blackstone River. Somewhere along that waterway, other families were living their lives, unaware that their creek was protected because a 16-year-old girl had refused to let a serial killer poison her community. As they walked back to the house, Sarah's phone rang. Another agent calling about another case, another community that needed help identifying environmental terrorism. Richard's network had been vast, and dismantling it would take years. "Mrs. Mitchell, we've identified a similar pattern in Oregon. A community leader opposing a development project recently died from what appears to be bacterial contamination." The agent's voice carried urgent concern. Sarah looked at Emma, who nodded with determined understanding. Their fight against Richard had ended, but their work protecting other communities was just beginning. "I'll be on the next flight," Sarah said. 3 hours later, Sarah and Emma were boarding a plane to Portland, carrying evidence files and water testing equipment. The grieving widow who'd once been intimidated by HOA violations was now a federal consultant on environmental terrorism, traveling the country to help other families fight back against predators who use nature itself as a weapon. As their plane lifted off, Sarah looked down at the neighborhood that had transformed her from victim to hero. The creek sparkled in the evening light, flowing freely toward the horizon. The houses stood strong and united, their windows glowing with the warmth of families who'd learned that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to surrender to evil. Richard Blackwood had intended to destroy their community and build luxury condos worth $300 million. Instead, he'd created something far more valuable, a neighborhood of heroes who would spend the rest of their lives protecting others from monsters like him. The creek flowed on, carrying paper boats and childhood dreams, protected forever by federal law and defended by a community that had learned the most important truth of all: when good people stand together, evil cannot prevail. Justice had been served. The creek ran free. And somewhere in federal prison, Richard Blackwood was learning that the only thing more powerful than a perfect plan for murder was a mother's perfect love for her child. The victory was complete. The end.